By April 1945, the most powerful military machine the world had ever seen was collapsing into rubble and ash. Adolf Hitler, the man who had promised a 1,000-year Reich, sat beneath Berlin in a concrete tomb, listening to artillery shells obliterate the city above his head. Outside, 2.5 million Soviet soldiers surrounded the German capital with 6,000 tanks and 41,000 artillery pieces. Inside the Führer bunker, 50 feet below the Reich Chancellery Gardens, Hitler clung to delusions of victory while his empire died. The final days of World War II in Europe would be decided not in grand battles or strategic retreats, but in a cramped, damp underground maze where a dictator would face the consequences of 12 years of totalitarian madness. What happened in that bunker during those last 2 weeks would determine not just Hitler's fate, but the conclusion of humanity's deadliest conflict. Before we go deeper into how this decision changed the war forever, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. The Führer bunker was not designed for prolonged habitation. It was built in 2 phases, an upper section completed in 1936 as a temporary air raid shelter, and a deeper, more fortified lower section, finished in 1944 as Allied bombing intensified. The lower bunker sat 8.5 meters beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden, its roof constructed from concrete, nearly 3 meters thick. Approximately 30 small rooms were protected by 4 meters of reinforced concrete walls. The complex was self-contained but deeply uncomfortable. The bunker sat below the water table, and pumps ran continuously to remove groundwater that seeped through cracks in the concrete. The air smelled of mildew and diesel fumes from the generators that provided electricity. A telephone switchboard connected the bunker to the outside world, and an army radio set with an outdoor antenna maintained military communications. But as the Battle of Berlin intensified, secure radio contact deteriorated. Hitler's command staff increasingly relied on telephone lines and BBC radio broadcasts to understand what was happening outside. The bunker was not a command center, it was a tomb dressed up as a headquarters. Hitler moved into the Führer bunker permanently on January 16, 1945. By then, Nazi Germany's strategic situation was catastrophic. Soviet forces had crossed the Oder River and stood just 60 kilometers east of Berlin. In the west, American and British forces had broken through German defenses in the Ardennes and were crossing the Rhine into the industrial heartland. German forces in Italy were withdrawing northward under relentless Allied pressure. Poland had fallen to the Red Army, which was now preparing to capture Berlin itself. The military logic was inescapable. Germany had lost the war, but Hitler refused to accept it. He continued issuing orders for counterattacks by divisions that no longer existed, demanding that exhausted armies hold positions they could not defend. His senior staff, including Martin Bormann and Joseph Goebbels, joined him in April, along with Eva Braun, his longtime companion. Magda Goebbels and her 6 children moved into the upper Vorbunker. 2 or 3 dozen support staff, secretaries, medical personnel, and bodyguards also sheltered there. The bunker became crowded, oppressive, and increasingly disconnected from reality. Hitler held afternoon military conferences in the Reich Chancellery's undamaged wing, then returned underground for the night. After several weeks, he rarely left the bunker except for brief walks in the garden with his dog, Blondie. The atmosphere was suffocating. Air raids occurred daily. Hitler spent most of his time on the lower level, where it was quieter. Conferences stretched late into the night, often until 5 in the morning. On March 19, 1945, Hitler issued the Nero Decree, an order for the complete destruction of German infrastructure. Named after the Roman emperor who allegedly burned his own city, the decree commanded that all industrial facilities, transportation networks, communication systems, and supply depots be demolished rather than captured by the Allies. Hitler's logic was vindictive and apocalyptic. If Germany could not prevail, he reasoned, then the German people deserved to perish. They had proven themselves weak. Armaments Minister Albert Speer quietly sabotaged the order, but Hitler's willingness to destroy his own nation revealed the depth of his psychological collapse. This was not strategic thinking. It was nihilistic rage. On April 16, 1945, the Red Army launched the final Soviet offensive. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front attacked from the east, while Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front struck from the south. The Soviets had concentrated overwhelming force, 2.5 million soldiers, including 78,556 Polish troops, supported by thousands of tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces. The Germans defending Berlin had 36 divisions totaling approximately 766,000 soldiers, but many were understrength, poorly equipped, or composed of elderly Volkssturm militia and Hitler Youth teenagers. German defenses centered on the Seelow Heights, a plateau overlooking the Oder River about 90 kilometers east of Berlin. General Gotthard Heinrici, commander of Army Group Vistula, had fortified the heights with anti-tank ditches, gun emplacements, and extensive trench networks. The battle for the Seelow Heights raged for 3 days. Soviet forces suffered heavy casualties pushing through the German lines, but sheer numerical superiority prevailed. By April 19th, the heights had fallen, and no defensive line stood between the Red Army and Berlin. On April 20th, Hitler's 56th birthday, Soviet artillery began shelling the city center for the first time. By April 21st, Red Army tanks reached the outskirts of Berlin. The encirclement was complete. Hitler's response to the encroaching disaster was delusional. On April 21st, he ordered SS Obergruppenführer Felix Steiner to counterattack the Soviet salient from the north. Hitler believed that Steiner's forces, combined with a northward attack by the German Ninth Army southeast of Berlin, would break the Soviet encirclement in a pincer movement. But Steiner's army detachment existed mostly on paper. It was a collection of battered units, training battalions, and Luftwaffe ground personnel with little combat experience and almost no heavy equipment. Steiner did not attack. He could not attack. When Hitler learned at his afternoon situation conference on April 22nd that Steiner's forces had not moved, he suffered what witnesses described as a complete nervous collapse. He launched into a tirade against his generals, calling them traitors and cowards. For the first time, he openly admitted that the war was lost. He declared that he would stay in Berlin until the end and then shoot himself. His staff pleaded with him to evacuate to Bavaria or the Alpen Redoubt, but Hitler refused. He asked SS physician Werner Hasse about the most reliable method of suicide. Hasse recommended combining cyanide with a gunshot to the head. The poison would kill quickly, and the bullet would ensure death even if the poison failed. Hitler's world was contracting. His empire had shrunk to a few square kilometers of rubble. Meanwhile, betrayals multiplied. Hermann Göring, Reichsmarshal, and Hitler's designated successor, sent a telegram from Bavaria asking for permission to assume leadership of the Reich. Göring cited Hitler's 1941 decree naming him as successor and suggested that Hitler's isolation in Berlin made him unable to govern. Martin Bormann convinced Hitler that the telegram was an attempted coup. Hitler responded by stripping Göring of all offices and ordering his arrest. The news came on April 22nd, the same day as Hitler's breakdown over Steiner's failed attack. Hitler also ordered his chief aide, Julius Schaub, to destroy his personal documents and his private train. The administrative machinery of the Third Reich was being dismantled from within. On April 28th, Hitler received even more devastating news. Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS, and one of the architects of the Holocaust, had secretly attempted to negotiate surrender terms with the Western Allies through Swedish Count Folke Bernadotte. A BBC broadcast, originating from Reuters, reported the attempted negotiations. Hitler considered this the ultimate betrayal. Himmler commanded the SS, controlled the police apparatus, and had been personally loyal to Hitler for over 2 decades. Now, with the end approaching, Himmler was trying to save himself by dealing with the enemy. Hitler's rage was volcanic. He ordered Himmler's arrest and had SS Gruppenführer Hermann Fegelein, Himmler's representative in the bunker and Eva Braun's brother-in-law, court-martialed and shot for desertion. Himmler's betrayal confirmed what Hitler already believed. Everyone had failed him. Germany's defeat was not his fault. It was the weakness and treachery of those beneath him. By the afternoon of April 28th, the Red Army had advanced to Potsdamer Platz, less than 1 kilometer from the Führer bunker. Soviet tanks and infantry were fighting street by street, building by building, toward the Reich Chancellery. Hitler made his final decisions. Shortly after midnight on April 29th, he married Eva Braun in a small civil ceremony in a map room within the bunker. The ceremony was conducted by a minor Nazi Party official brought in for the purpose. Witnesses included Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann. After a modest wedding breakfast, Hitler dictated his last will and testament to his secretary, Traudl Junge. The documents appointed Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz as head of state and Joseph Goebbels as chancellor. Hitler signed the documents at 4 a.m. and went to bed. The marriage lasted less than 40 hours. On the afternoon of April 29th, Hitler learned that Benito Mussolini had been executed by Italian partisans. Mussolini and his mistress, Clara Petacci, had been captured while trying to flee to Switzerland. Their bodies were shot, then hung upside down by their heels in a public square in Milan, where crowds mocked and spat on the corpses. The news deeply affected Hitler. He had no intention of allowing himself or Eva to suffer a similar fate. He became determined that their bodies would be burned immediately after death, leaving nothing for the Soviets to display as trophies. Hitler also tested the cyanide capsules he had received from Himmler through SS physician Ludwig Stumpfegger. Hitler's distrust of Himmler now extended to the poison itself. He ordered his dog Blondie to be given one of the capsules. The dog died instantly. The cyanide was genuine. On the morning of April 30th, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel reported that all forces Hitler had been depending on to rescue Berlin had either been encircled or forced onto the defensive. There would be no relief. Around 2:30 in the morning, Hitler appeared in the corridor where about 20 people had assembled to say farewell. He went down the line, shaking hands and speaking briefly with each person, then retired to his quarters. Late in the morning, General Helmuth Weidling, commander of the Berlin defense area, reported that the garrison would likely run out of ammunition that night. The fighting would end within 24 hours. Weidling requested permission for a breakout attempt. Hitler did not answer immediately, but by early afternoon he granted permission. At around 1 in the afternoon, Hitler, 2 secretaries, and his personal cook had lunch. Afterward, Hitler and Eva said goodbye to the remaining bunker staff and occupants, including Bormann, Goebbels, military officers, and secretaries. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, Adolf and Eva Hitler entered his personal study. SS Sturmbannführer Otto Günsche, Hitler's adjutant, stood guard outside the door. After some time, Hitler's valet, Heinz Linge, entered the antechamber and smelled gunpowder smoke. He returned to the corridor and told Bormann. The 2 men entered the study together. They found Hitler and Eva sitting upright on a sofa. Hitler's head was canted to the right, blood dripping from his right temple and pooling on the sofa's arm. A 7.65 millimeter Walter pistol lay at his feet. Eva showed no visible wounds, and her face displayed the telltale signs of cyanide poisoning. Günsche later testified that Hitler had shot himself in the right temple, while Eva bit down on a cyanide capsule. The time was approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, April 30th, 1945. Adolf Hitler was dead. Günsche left the study and announced Hitler's death to the group in the briefing room, which included Goebbels, Generals Hans Krebs and Wilhelm Burgdorf, and Hitler Youth leader Arthur Axmann. These men, along with others, viewed the bodies to confirm death. In accordance with Hitler's written and verbal instructions, his body was wrapped in a blanket and carried up the stairs through the bunker's emergency exit to the Reich Chancellery garden. Eva's body followed. The remains were placed in a shallow shell crater. Petrol was poured over the bodies. After several failed attempts to ignite the fuel, Bormann lit a roll of papers and threw them onto the corpses. As the bodies caught fire, a group including Bormann, Günsche, Linge, Goebbels, and several others raised their arms in a Nazi salute from just inside the bunker doorway. The Red Army continued shelling the area intermittently throughout the afternoon. SS guards brought additional cans of petrol to keep the fire burning. Eyewitnesses later testified that the copious fuel reduced the remains to charred bones and ash that fell apart to the touch. By approximately 6:30 in the evening, the cremation was complete. The ashes were covered in the shallow bomb crater. The news of Hitler's death did not reach the outside world immediately. On the morning of May 1st, General Krebs met with Soviet General Vasily Chuikov to negotiate a ceasefire. Krebs informed Chuikov of Hitler's death and attempted to open peace negotiations. Stalin, informed around 4 in the morning Berlin time, demanded unconditional surrender. Krebs lacked the authority to agree. The negotiations failed. That night, German state radio announced that Hitler had died that afternoon defending Berlin. Grand Admiral Dönitz, now head of state, called on the German people to mourn their Führer, whom he claimed had died a hero's death. Dönitz's strategy was to surrender to the Western Allies while continuing to fight the Soviets, hoping to save as many German soldiers and civilians as possible from Soviet captivity. His tactic partially succeeded. About 1.8 million German soldiers avoided Soviet capture by surrendering westward, but it came at enormous cost in bloodshed as fighting continued until May 8th. On May 2nd, Soviet forces captured the Reich Chancellery. Inside the Führer bunker, Krebs and Burgdorf shot themselves. Soviet counterintelligence unit SMERSH began searching for Hitler's remains. In early May, Hitler's and Eva's dental remains were extracted from the soil in the garden. By May 11th, Hitler's dentist's assistant and dental technician identified the remains as belonging to Hitler and Braun. The Soviet Union restricted the release of information and issued contradictory reports about Hitler's death, part of a deliberate disinformation campaign by Joseph Stalin. The Soviets alternately claimed Hitler had died by cyanide or that he had escaped and fled to another country. This confusion fueled conspiracy theories that persisted for decades. West Germany issued an official death certificate for Hitler in 1956. In 2025, DNA analysis of blood from the sofa in Hitler's study confirmed it was Hitler's blood, providing additional forensic evidence of his suicide by gunshot. The Führer bunker itself survived the war largely intact, though the outer ruins of the Reich Chancellery buildings were leveled by the Soviets between 1945 and 1949. In December 1947, the Soviets attempted to blow up the bunker, but only separation walls were damaged. In 1959, the East German government began demolishing remaining sections. During construction of residential housing in the area in 1988 to 89, crews uncovered underground sections of the bunker complex. Most were destroyed. Other parts were filled in, resealed, or ignored. Government authorities wanted no Nazi landmarks remaining. The site remained unmarked until 2006, when a single information board was installed showing a schematic diagram of the bunker's layout. The board stands at the corner of In den Ministergarten and Gertrud Kolmarstrasse, about 3 minutes' walk from Potsdamer Platz. It presents a mundane historical record rather than a memorial. The final days in the Führer bunker reveal the collapse of the Nazi regime not through grand military defeats, but through the disintegration of a single man's mind. Hitler's last orders were issued to armies that no longer existed. His final days were spent in a concrete hole, listening to the consequences of his ideology obliterate the city above. The bunker was a microcosm of the Third Reich itself, fortified on the outside, rotting from within, and ultimately unable to withstand the forces it had unleashed. Hitler's suicide did not end the war immediately, but it removed the ideological core around which Nazi Germany had organized itself. Without Hitler, the regime simply ceased to function. Donitz's government was a legal fiction maintained for 1 week to facilitate surrender. The Battle of Berlin continued until May 2nd, when General Weidling surrendered the city's remaining defenders. The war in Europe officially ended on May 8th. By then, Germany was occupied, its cities were rubble, and millions of its soldiers and civilians were dead. Hitler's vision of a 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years. His final days in the bunker were the inevitable conclusion of a regime built on racial hatred, totalitarian control, and military conquest. The man who had promised to reshape the world died in a flooded concrete tomb beneath the ruins of his own capital. History records few ironies sharper than this. The dictator who demanded absolute loyalty was betrayed by his closest subordinates in his final days. The man who ordered the destruction of entire cities died while his own capital burned above him. The leader who claimed to embody the German nation chose suicide rather than face the consequences of his actions. The Führer bunker was not a command center from which brilliant strategies emerged. It was a place where delusion confronted reality and chose death over surrender. What happened in those final days beneath Berlin was not heroic or tragic. It was simply the logical endpoint of a regime that valued power over humanity and conquest over civilization. The bunker remains a historical lesson rendered in concrete and ash. It is a reminder that no fortress, no ideology, and no leader is invincible when the forces of history turn against them. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.